I'm Molly Starback, Director of the Duke Office of Postdoctoral Services. And today we're very pleased to welcome you to our workshop on the NIH K99 R00 Career Awards at the Scientific Interface, or CASI Awards. This workshop is part of our Duke Virtual Orientation Series and will be recorded. So we are very pleased to welcome Tammy Collins, PhD, who is a Program Officer at the Burroughs Wellcome Fund and RTP. Tammy directs both the CASI program and the Innovations in Regulatory Science Awards. And prior to joining BWF, she was the director of the Office of Fellows Career Development at NIEHS and RTP, which is where I met Tammy. Several of you submitted questions through the registration, so Tammy will be addressing those in her talk. And as always, please feel free to post other questions in the chat. Tammy, thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Molly. It's so good to be here. And, thanks for all of you for having me. So I'm going to be telling you today about just general tips for applying for a K99 award. And this is based on my experience at NIEHS over the past, 7 to 8 years, where I helped a lot of fellows navigate that process and apply for K99 at a variety of different NIH institutes and centers. And then, I'm also going to contrast and compare that with the Burroughs Wellcome Fund's Career Award at the Scientific Interface, because there are a lot of key similarities as well as some differences between these two mechanisms. So essentially, we're going to be talking about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of both applying for a K99 R00 as well as a CASI award. And I'm going to start with the first half of going through the K99 R00, and then, we can take a brief break before I talk about the CASI award. So the first thing I like to start off with is, asking why even apply for a grant in the first place. Obviously, people want to get funding in order to do their research, but there are a lot of reasons that applying for a grant is beneficial beyond solely the funding, and I will address a few of those here in a minute. Specifically in terms of why apply for a K99 R00. So this grant is really meant for those who really need additional time in the mentored postdoctoral phase. So let's say you need to learn a new technique, a new methodology, you need more time as a postdoc in order to gain that experience. So another 1 to 2 years of mentored training. And then the R00 phase supports your transition into an independent tenure track faculty position. And you can receive a maximum of $249,000 per year. One of the things I wanted to point out is that this is inclusive of indirect costs, however, meaning that you don't actually see this full amount for your research. And what you actually see is going to be dependent on what the indirect cost negotiated rate is between NIH and your specific institution. And that's going to come into play whenever I compare this with the CASI award, because we don't actually provide indirect costs. So everything that we provide is direct to you. One of the things about the K99 R00 is that you can have no more than 4 years of postdoctoral experience, either at the time of a new application or a resubmitted application, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, that process in terms of the timeline. International fellows are eligible for this mechanism. Let's see if there was anything else I wanted to say here. Yeah, I'm not going to highlight all the extension eligibilities on extension, but suffice to say there are eligibility extensions as it relates to childcare and family care, both for the K99 as well as the CASI, which we recently codified this year, actually. So additional reasons to apply for a grant, and some of this I'm going to be telling you based off of my experience at NIEHS. So it's a time in which, whether you actually wind up receiving the funding or not, you're creating your research plan, you're thinking about what you are going to do in the future, what is going to be the first stages and experiments you're going to be doing whenever you're a tenure track investigator. And you're really laying out essentially a large part of some of the things you would be submitting for your application package if you're interested in going on the academic job market. And I'm mentioning the beneficiality of this because At NIHS, for example, while we can't deny that if you get a K99, it really is going to help you get an academic career. We also saw a large number of people that wound up going into an academic career that didn't necessarily get the grant, but that maybe had applied for it, and this whole process helped set the stage for them to have a competitive academic application packet, which then launched them into getting an R01 or other types of funding once they received their academic position. Another thing in terms of applying for a grant is it really a time to be creative and think of new ideas and really delve into the literature and come up with some of the best approaches and methodologies and research questions that you can as it relates to the scientific question that you're trying to address. So that's, I think, another key benefit that I really wanted to highlight, outside of solely receiving the funding for a grant. And if you look at, and maybe after this, I can share some of the information, there's literature out there indicating, what are some of the requirements for getting academic positions. And in some cases, you may hear, I think anecdotally, people hear you have to have a grant, but that is actually not the case whenever you actually look at the literature on this. So the next question I wanted to bring up was the question of when, and that was a question I saw a lot of people had is when should they be applying? So as it relates to that, I wanted to talk about the key application cycles and really clarify those, also in the context of the eligibility requirements for the K99. So making it clear, so there are 3 times per year that you could apply for a K99 R00. And these are based on NIH's grant application cycles. So for the career development awards more specifically, there's cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, and those career development awards, if it's a brand new application, would be due in February, June, or October. If you're submitting a resubmitted grant, let's say that you applied, you didn't receive it, so you want to resubmit that after addressing some of the reviewers' comments, those applications are staggered by a month. And so any resubmissions would be either March, July, and November. So they're staggered from when the new ones are due. So when should you be applying? So you've got 4 years of an eligibility window. So if you apply what you might consider too early, you would not have enough preliminary data, but there's plenty of time to prepare the grant and to resubmit it if you need to. If you apply what might be considered too late, you wouldn't have much time to prepare the grant and no time for a resubmission if you don't get it on that first attempt. So it's essentially a one shot and done. That being said, whenever I did an analysis, at least at NIHS, we had about half and half in terms of those who got it on the first attempt versus a second. So you don't absolutely have to have a second attempt to get it per se. But a lot of times people want to leave that buffer, in order to know that they've got that. So that brings us to, what might be considered just right. Maybe 2.5, approaching 3 years in, where you have enough preliminary data and enough time to resubmit the grant if needed, because you remember that both the new and resubmitted grants have to be within that 4-year window of postdoctoral experience. So, explaining a little bit further in terms of like your own personal decision of when to apply and looking at these cycles. So in cycle 2, for example, the career development awards are due in June. So what you can see is that the scientific merit review would be happening sometime in the fall between October and November. And then the advisory council round. So this is when, they've got the scores, they know what the applications, how they're ranked, and they make the ultimate decision as to which grants they're going to fund. So it would take a little while before you know if you're actually going to get funded or not. And your earliest project start date would be April. So if we look at this on a timeline, so let's say that you were to apply next June, for example. So in the fall, that's where you either receive your score or learn whether it was not discussed. If you got a good score and got good feedback, it would take you until January when that advisory council round meets to find out whether you're actually going to get the grant or not. And the earliest project start date is in April. So let's say that you were on the borderline and you wound up not getting the grant. So now you want to resubmit it. So this is in January when you find out about that. So you could resubmit as early as March, so just a couple of months later, because if you remember, those resubmission deadlines are staggered by a month. So instead of February for the new ones, it's March for a resubmission. So in this case, let's say that you resubmit in March of 2025. And then in the summer is when you, receive your score. Also, we'll learn whether it was not discussed. And for this particular cycle, it's either October or August as to whether the advisory council meets, depending on which institute you apply to. That's when you find out whether or not you're going to get the grant, and your earliest project start date is either September or December. So the general rule of thumb is that you want to skip at least one cycle in between new and resubmitted applications in terms of thinking about your timeline for eligibility to do a resubmission. So if your new application is in June of 2024, you would skip cycle 3. So this was cycle 2. You'd skip cycle 3 while you're waiting on results, and you could resubmit as early as cycle 1 of the next year in March of 2025. Let's say that you applied in, next fall in October of 2024 in cycle 3. You skip cycle 1 when the new year starts while you're waiting on results, and then you could resubmit again in cycle 2 of July of 2025 while you're waiting on results. So if you want to give yourself enough of a buffer that you can resubmit at least once, this is the general rule of thumb to follow when you're trying to calculate your eligibility as it relates to these. So the next question that people have is, where do you actually submit your grant? And if you look at the funding opportunity number for the K99, there are lots of NIH institutes and centers that participate in this and give grants in this area, but they each have their own priorities in terms of their mission and the types of scientific questions that they want to fund. And this is where you can find the list of all of these centers here. In this particular example, this is one in which a clinical trial is not allowed. So they're split into 2 different funding opportunity announcements, or now I think they've actually slightly tweaked the word to notice of funding opportunity. One of the questions I saw in the ones that were submitted to Molly was also, what's the difference between the Mosaic K99 relative to a general K99? So that one actually has a separate announcement. And the key aspect of this is that it's really supports a cohort of early independent investigators from diverse backgrounds. And really the long-term goal of this is to enhance diversity in the biomedical research workforce. Individuals that apply through Mosaic and the cohorts that get this award actually have structured and dedicated training that is organized through essentially institutional awards. So American Society for Cell Biology, I think, is one that provides training and support for Mosaic scholars. And I want to say that ASB&B might be another one, but there are a number of professional societies that are connected with Mosaic that have cohort activities for those individuals whose research is aligned with those professional societies. Candidates for this are encouraged to apply no later in their 3rd year, and just pointing out that individuals from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, as well as those with disabilities, are always encouraged to apply for support. So now when it comes to thinking about which actual institute to apply to, one of the things that I encourage people to really check out is the NIH Reporter. So with this, you can go and click on the link that says funding and go down and look at success rates. And you want to look at training and research career development programs, and specifically the K Awards. So what I encourage people to do is to see what the success rate is at the different institutions, and also at the same time, look at how your research fits into the mission of those organizations or of those NIH institutes and centers. So if we pull out some examples here, this is looking at K99 success rates, both by year and by, when I say IC, this is NIH Institute or Center. So in this case, I downloaded an Excel spreadsheet filtered specifically by K99 mechanisms, and decided to look at 2018, 2019, and 2020. And I just decided to check out a number of different NIH institutes and centers. In this case, looking at NCI, heart, lung, and blood, general medical sciences, child health, NIHS, environmental health sciences, and mental health. And what you can see is that there's a wide variety in terms of the number of applications that get reviewed from these different institutes and centers relative to what's awarded. And you see some variation in the success rate. Specifically here with NCI, you see it has one of the lower success rates. In 2019, you can see it's even lower at 12%. 2020, it's at 18%. If you compare to something like NICHD, you see it's at 36%, 34%. It dipped a little in 2020. And if we look at 2021, you see this goes back up to close to 32%, and NCI is still below 20%. So what you can get a sense of by checking out this information first is to see, let's say that your research is on the border of being applicable to NCI's mission, as well as the mission of NICHD. And you can structure it to focus on one mission or another, depending on which one you're choosing to apply to. And maybe looking at these differences in success rate might make a difference in terms of which one you decide to actually apply to. Another thing is, as we've been talking about, is the mission of that NIH Institute and Center. And one of the ways that you can get a sense of whether your research fits a certain institute is to use this tool called Matchmaker on the NIH Reporter site. So what that does, it allows you to enter information. Let's say that it's the first paragraph or of your latest abstract on an article that's highly relevant to the research you're proposing to do. Or maybe it's even part of the research plan that you're already starting to develop. You've already started to write. So what you could do is paste some of that information into this text box, and you can click on similar program officials and find program officers that have portfolios of grants that are similar to some of the work that you're doing from a research standpoint. So if you click search here, and then this will take you to the next page, and you can see in this particular example, you get a list of program officials, and it tells you what institute or center they're at. So in this case, we see a number that are at NIAID, allergy and infectious diseases. So what that's saying is that your research is probably highly applicable to the mission of NIAID, and it would be a place that you would consider applying. NIGMS, General Medical Sciences, it looks like they also are supporting research that's similar to this. So this is a way, as well to kind of get a sense of where it might make the most sense for you to apply to. And then if you actually click on view email, their email will pop up and you can connect with them directly. And what I always recommend people to do is to send a list of their specific aims and ask, the program officer, in general, if this is, fits within the mission of their institute, and is it something that they could see that the institute would be generally interested in funding. So now we're going to move over to the next question, which is the question of who. So who are some of the key players in all of this? Obviously, you are going to be the most important key player, but there are a number of individuals that will be assisting you along the way. So the NIH program officers, which we've just talked about, can help you determine which institute or center to apply to. And then your mentor is going to really be key in terms of providing grant feedback. But not only that, but a support letter, which is going to be different than a reference letter per se. And this is where they're going to talk more about, how you think as a scientist, more specifically about what your project is doing. And, we always encourage them to also address how what you're doing is something that you can take and go and develop an independent career on that won't directly compete with your mentor's research as well. Your graduate advisor will provide a reference letter. And another thing that we would recommend is that to ask them to speak to your scientific potential, as well as what sort of unplowed ground you're addressing in your scientific research. Collaborators and co-mentors, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on this. So this is really where they can demonstrate their support for you to learn new techniques or gain new expertise. And this can really come into play with, the aspect of why you need additional time in that mentored training postdoctoral role, rather than, being ready to immediately go on into an academic position. And what I would encourage is that they would not just solely say, yes, I'm going to help them. What I would encourage is to have a very detailed and structured plan. So in one example of someone I saw that was successful, they wanted to learn, they were an experimentalist and they wanted to gain more experience in bioinformatics analysis and this type of approach. And so they set up a team of bioinformaticians that, they had regularly scheduled meetings. They talked about what specifically they were going to be training them in, and they really spelled out what they were going to do. And this also went a long way in terms of showing to the review committee that these collaborators and co-mentors were serious about their commitment in providing help and support to the applicant. When it comes to the institution, so they are there to provide your institutional support letter, to actually submit the grant on your behalf, and also to potentially provide any additional guidance or templates. I'm going to show you some of the things that we did at NIHS in this regard. And I would say, we would be willing to share some of the samples. And it's also up to you to see, specifically what Duke may or may not provide in this regard as it relates to boilerplate templates and that type of thing. So that moves us over to the next question for the K99 R00, which is the what and the how. So in terms of what will your institution provide, so they will need to provide you with an ERA Commons account or affiliation. And, you just need to identify who at your institution handles this, and timelines for creation can be variable. One of the things we've seen, even in my role here as a program officer at Burroughs Wellcome, is that, people waited to the last minute, and let's say there was like a 2-week absolute timeline at the institution for creating an ERA Commons account. And if you don't ask that at least 2 weeks before the deadline, you risk not being able to apply on time. So just making sure that, you handle and address these things early in the process so that this isn't some glitch that holds you up at the last minute. Also note that you'll need to create an ORCID ID and affiliate your ERA Commons with this in order to submit a grant. And then when it comes to the workspace, so this is going to vary based on the institution in terms of whether you submit through NIH Assist, grants.gov or something that the institution themselves actually creates, at the institutional level that feeds this information into NIH Assist or grants.gov. And as I mentioned, some may provide templates and examples and just, identify this early in the process. The institutional letter of support and commitment. One of the things that we did at NIHS was provide a variety of templates that we shared and allowed the candidate to streamline this specifically for their needs, and making sure that this institutional letter of commitment really contained everything that the instructions are laying out in the SF 424 instructions as it relates to the grant. So that takes us now to the next question, which is looking a little bit more scientifically in terms of how to actually structure your specific aims. So these are things, I would say these are general guidelines that have worked over the years. You don't necessarily have to have 3 specific aims. Most people have at least 2. And generally, what we've seen that's been successful is for the first aim to be providing sort of something they're going to be doing immediately, possibly related to a proof of concept. And this would be work that you would be doing during the K99 training phase. As it relates to specific aim 2, so this would be day 1 of the R00 phase. And this would need to build the basis for you to get publications and get additional research so that you can springboard to apply for an R01. So when I say short-term capability, I'm saying that because you need to be able to get some type of publications, so that you can use those in that springboard to the R01. In cases where people choose to do a specific aim 3, this may really be some of the longer term overarching aspects of the research goal, and really demonstrating how, if you're able to answer a particular research question, that this would demonstrate the real impact on the field and, close ties in with the Institute's mission in terms of solving certain scientific questions. Additional general tips that I would say as it relates to the K99 is ensuring that you're addressing unmet questions in the field and really advancing the field forward, and that it's not necessarily a me too step, which would mean, if someone discovered this and, you in one system or situation, and then you're saying, you're discovering something highly related in another organism or situation. You really want to be innovating and doing something, advancing the field forward. And obviously, because this is NIH, you're always going to need to show how your work is tying back to human health. And this is something that is really key, these next couple of bullets, and I'm going to highlight those when I show some anonymized examples of reviewer comments. And that's to really ensure that you're doing hypothesis-driven work that is not blind screening, and spelling out how you're going to test things. So, actually saying, if you're going to conduct this test, and if you see this particular result, you'll know that the answer is either A or B, and then you're going to move on to test X, Y, and Z. So you're kind of walking them through your thought process, what you're planning to do, what you potentially anticipate seeing, and if you get one result or another, what would you anticipate that meaning? The next bullet is, showing that you're using multiple approaches to answer the questions, and you've thought out how and where things could fail. But obviously you don't want your research project to be about how everything could fail. So you want to allude to that you have thought about potential backup plans, but tempered the extent to which you focus on this particular bullet. And then the final one, I would say this is probably the most important out of everything, which is that the aims should not solely depend on one another, meaning that if aim 1 doesn't provide the answer that you're potentially expecting, is that going to make the entire rest of the grant fall apart or be unfeasible to do? And I would say that's going to be something really quickly that would get you scored lowly, scored not as well by the reviewers. So continuing on in terms of the practicalities and logistics of how you apply. So at NIHS, we actually use the grants.gov system. And we actually provided some degree of boilerplate template for many of the files that were asked, for the application. Here's an example here for the Career Development Award section, where we would put in a really old sample of responsible conduct of research language, because, you can't plagiarize this or use it. You have to adjust it to make it specific to your own training, but just to give people a sense of what might go into, a section on RCR, or a description of the institutional environment, and making sure that then, you take this, look at it as an example and create your own that also highlights aspects of your department specific activities or other things beyond the institution itself. We also gave some boilerplate examples of like sample facilities, sample equipment, this type of thing, but obviously you're going to have to tweak that for what's specific in terms of what you have access to. In terms of seeing a successful K99 R00, there on the NIHS website, we have grant workshops and resources. There is a section on where this individual posted his own successful K99, as well as the R00, I think, as well. And then more recently, NIA has released, I think, 4 different sample applications of K99 R00, some that were funded and some not, so that you can see the difference between those. So I would highly recommend checking out these sites for some of the sample applications. I'm not going to get into all the details today, but just wanted to mention that when I was at NIHS, we had some, great postdocs that wound up creating essentially kind of a peer support network. And we were able to get someone to share one of their grants confidentially with the individuals who took part in this group. And, each week they would focus on a different aspect, whether it's, the biosketch or specific aims or what have you. So that was something that was also helpful to people in terms of preparing for the grant. So before I switch gears and talk about the CASI program, I wanted to, end by showing you some paraphrased comments from the reviewers that have been anonymized on K99s, both an example of one that was not funded initially, but then wound up receiving a fundable score. So in this case, we're just looking at the weakness comments for the candidate. One of the things the reviewers said is their publications were in press, so lack of productivity was a concern because they didn't see any publications. For the career development section, they felt that their training in these 2 different areas was limited, and the plans to assist the applicant in grant writing to reshape the R00 were absent. When it comes to the research, they mentioned how preliminary data was absent, and a description of how X is going to be analyzed is absent. The hypothesis and analysis details were in need of clarification. So that kind of speaks to something I mentioned a couple of slides ago, when I was really emphasizing that you need to describe what you're going to analyze and what are the anticipated results. When it comes to the mentor, co-mentor, consultant, and collaborator. So in this particular case, they mentioned that the 2 main mentors had limited experience in transitioning fellows to academia, but that was mitigated by having this other person on the team. And on-site training in this other particular area was absent. As far as the environment and institutional commitment, lack of, this particular research in neighboring labs, but that's really not anything that the fellow can do anything about. So but for what it's worth, that's what was mentioned in this. So I wanted to contrast that with the new application that the fellow put together that actually was then received a fundable score. So this is paraphrased weakness comments, and then I'm also going to show you some of the strengths. So in terms of weakness, you can see that they had very little as compared to what we saw before, none for the candidate, none for career development. For research, they said that some of the additional data didn't support some of the main hypotheses. And then, they had no concerns about the mentors, co-mentors, or about the environment. So now, this is looking at the strengths of the one that was now funded. So for the candidate, so they said, since the original proposal, they received a first author in a nature-based journal. As it relates to career development, they received additional support for, X, Y, and Z area that they were concerned about by adding some other people to the mentoring team. So you can see, they've addressed their concern about productivity by getting an authorship, and then here they added other individuals to their team. And then as it relates to research, they've added significant preliminary data since the proposal that validates this particular thing. And once again, just highlighting that they expanded the team for expertise in this particular area since the proposal, and that they thought the institutional environment was excellent. So after this, I'm going to be switching gears to talk about CASI, but I thought, I would pause for a second to maybe answer any specific additional questions about the K99. And I don't know, Molly, I see that there's things in the chat, but for some reason, I can't actually click on that. So I don't know if there's anything there that I should read or that you wouldn't mind letting me know about.
Yep, so I will start at the top. A question from Susanna. My postdoc start date was July 1st, 2020, and I'm applying this year for the K99 in October. I thought I would be able to resubmit in June next year if necessary, but will I be too far into my postdoc then, since the resub date is 1 month later?
Yeah, and so sorry, and this may be something that they have to, so what was the date that they got? When did they start doing their postdoc research, they said?
Susanna started on July 1st, 2020. July
1st, 2020. Okay. And yeah, because it would be July 12th. Yeah, 2024. Yeah, that's right on the cusp. So in that case, that's a case where I think I would reach out to the program officer at the specific institute that you're considering. Another thing which I didn't mention, so in terms of eligibility, they have built in their specific extensions for 1 month for the birth of a child, anything that you've taken away due to family or other responsibilities does not count towards the eligibility window. So I saw that you're starting sort of still in the middle of COVID, and if that affected some of those things for you, I would talk about that with the program officer. And then aside from that, there had been, so they had been doing things where they had extended the deadlines beyond the 4 years, but now they have something where they say, in general, if you want to request an extension because of, what COVID did to your research career, then you can outline how it delayed you. So if there are things where you can point to and how this delayed your research, I would imagine, I don't want to speak for them, but I would imagine having only like a few days difference, it seems like they may be lenient, or I would hope they would be.
Got it. Thank you. All right, our next question is, does graduate advisor mean the PhD chair or the postdoc supervisor?
So when I was talking about graduate advisor, it was the graduate supervisor.
Next question is, regarding 4 years after completion of PhD, Okay, is there an exception for women who took maternity leave? So
Yeah.
you just covered that.
Right?
1
year. Mhm.
1 year. And then I posted a link to my research path at Duke. I would suggest that everyone go on my research path. You can search it by your field, by School of Medicine, and it outlines for you the process of putting together your K award or F award or DoD award and how to submit it at Duke. Also talk to the grants manager in your department. Every department has a grants manager, and that's the person who will be helping you put it together on the department end. All right, so next question is, okay, and now for some reason emojis are popping up out of nowhere. When do they start counting postdoc experience years? At the moment you start your postdoc or when you graduate?
So that is a interesting question that I struggled to always find the answer to. And what I finally found the answer to is that it actually depends on the NIH institute that you're applying to. And it's not done the same across all the institutions. So some base it on, when you do your defense date, some base it on when you get your degree. And there are some that actually spell it out online, like what they base it on. And some you kind of have to ask their program officer what they base it on, but it's not completely clear and it varies by institution.
Okay, good to know. Next question. I have a question regarding the selection of IC for K99. If my proposal fits into the scope of 2 NIH ICs, and I'm not sure which one is better for my application, is it possible for me to specify both of them as ICs that I want my application to be assigned to, or is only one allowed?
So they're only going to allow you to do it to one. I don't know if they've changed this. There used to be a way for you to specify your preference. And I think you've got like 3 preferences and you can order them like first, second, third, I seem to recall. And so I guess I would say to talk with the program officers at each of those as it relates to that. Yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Okay, good. And then we have, I think, a comment from Drew. Some ICs specify a 1-month extension for the resubmission, e.g. NINDS. Receipt dates for amended K99 applications are March 12th, July 12th, and November 12th. For resubmissions, A1 applications, the eligibility window will be extended to 49 months. And then there's a link. So thank you for the tip. And so next question, in the proposal, should all these 3 aims be strongly related, especially for the 3rd aim, long-term aim?
Yeah, they should be strongly related, just not absolutely dependent on one another.
So not like dominoes where, yeah, got it. And Josie asks, can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons for resubmission, repackaging, and applying as a new application?
Sorry, the pros and cons for, say that again. Could you please say that again?
I think pros and cons for resubmitting versus repackaging and applying as a new application. So kind of starting all over again.
Yeah, I mean, so if you repackage as I guess that would depend on just how different it is from, your first proposal. Like, is it truly a brand new proposal? And I would say, as you can see from looking at the things I just compared and contrasted, if they give you, I guess it depends on if you're able to address some of their concerns from, the first submission. And, here you could see that clearly the candidate was able to address all of them. They got a publication, they had more data, added more people to the team. And so I think, from a mental standpoint, the review committee is like, okay, they have taken our concerns into consideration and addressed all of these things. So I guess if you completely repackaged it, I guess you don't, they may be viewing it with completely new eyes and may still have some related concerns. So I guess it kind of depends on how much you're able to address what their concerns were from the first one.
Okay, good. Thank you, Tammy. And that is the end of the questions. So time to move on to CASI.
All right. Yeah. I was going to say, do you want me to just keep going? Do you want to take a 5-minute break? Like, what do you think?
I'd say let's keep going.
Okay. All right, well, we will keep going and switch gears to the CASI program. And this won't be quite as involved as the K99 section. So this is the career awards at the scientific interface, and we're still going to address the same who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. And I'm going to show you quite a bit of the reviewer feedback as it relates to this. So when it comes to why apply for a CASI award, so this is a 5-year, $560,000 postdoc to faculty bridging award. So there's a lot of similarities to K99 R00, but in the fact that it's a bridging award. It's 1 to 2 years of mentor training in the postdoctoral phase at $100,000 per year. And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight is that we have recently increased our stipend allowance to allow up to $80,000 to be used in the initial year of the CASI award and up to $85,000 to be used in the second year. We also are allowing up to $5,000 per year to be applied towards childcare expenses for the duration of the award, both in the postdoc as well as the faculty phase. And then, for the independent research support, so similar to the K99, we provide up to 3 years. So this would be, once you got into a tenure track position. And this is where I wanted to highlight some of those differences. So this is at $120,000 a year, but also note that these are all direct costs. No indirect costs come out of this. And so this is all money that goes straight to you and your lab. Another difference is that you can have no more than 5 years for the CASI award as opposed to K99, which is 4. International fellows are also eligible. And another thing that I also will point out here is that we support individuals at institutions both in the United States and Canada. And some people have liked that aspect about CASI. So if they are in a US institution when they apply and maybe they want to go to a Canadian institution for their tenure track, then that is fine. In terms of like where you can be at your institution, it's US and Canada. And that would be in contrast to the K99, which would support individuals in the United States. Also, so this is really the key distinction about CASI is that it is specific to researchers bringing skills from the chemical, physical, computational, mathematical sciences, and engineering to focus on biological questions at the scientific interface. So in terms of when to apply, it's more simple because there's only one application cycle per year. That being said, we've got 3 phases. So we have a phase 1, which is called a letter of intent. And for this phase, this is what we're in right now. That should say 4,000 character, sorry, not 4,000 word. You would submit a 4,000 character essay. As well as your mentor would submit a reference letter. And I'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what's important to include there. And what I think is helpful for a lot of people as it relates to this is it gives you a chance to showcase to the reviewers what your research project is, what you want to do without having to write the entire full application. And then, for those research projects that are most in line with the goals of the CASI program, a subset will be invited to submit a full application in phase 2. And then the final phase, we will have a subset that are invited to interview. So in terms of when you can apply, so the letters of intent are due in about a month, so September 1st. The full applications are due in January, and you get notified around, mid-November, mid to late November, about whether you're invited to submit a full application. One thing I will point out, though, is that really for the full application, the majority of what you need is your bio sketch. There will be a personal statement and your research plan. Your mentor's letter will just transfer over, and you'll get some other reference letters from other people. But in terms of like the relative commitment of what you've got to put together for CASI as compared to a K99. There's a lot less in terms of forms and various things that you have to fill out. In terms of the interview stage, so you will, for those who are finalists, you would interview April 24th and 25th of 2024 and find out in June of the, a couple months later, whether you received the award. In terms of when should you apply, so this would be somewhat similar to the K99 with a couple of exceptions. One is that you can have unlimited resubmissions, but on the flip side, there's only one chance to apply per year. So if you apply too early, you won't have enough time to have built a publication record, but there's plenty of time to prepare the grant and you have unlimited resubmissions. If you apply what might be considered too late, you won't have as much time to prepare the grant, and the review committee might express concerns about the length of time in the postdoc. And then somewhere where it's just right is where you really have enough time to clearly formulate your ideas and have built a record of achievement. You can resubmit it if needed. And I did want to note that a first author publication is required. That being said, it doesn't have to be from your postdoc phase. A first author from your graduate phase can also be used as the first author publication requirement for CASI. In terms of where to apply, that's also more simple because it's only at Burroughs Wellcome Fund. And here is the QR code if you want to get a link to the career awards at the scientific interface in terms of where to find our requests for proposals, how to begin a proposal. These are our letter of intent instructions. And if you actually continue to scroll down on this page, you can look at some of the former grant recipients if you click on that at the bottom of the page. And there's also a place for you to click on our review committee, essentially. And we are going to be adding about 4 to 5 more individuals for this coming cycle, and we'll be updating that soon as well. So this is looking at, one of the first pages of our request for proposals and just giving you a sense of, what the timeline is, which is also spelled out on our website. Also wanted to indicate, that we really strongly encourage applications from those who have been underrepresented in the research enterprise. And we have a description, of individuals underrepresented as well. And some of these types of things can be addressed in the personal statement. If there's also any other characteristics or situations that you would like to talk about and highlight in your personal statement, you can feel free to include those. But that would be for the full invited application phase that you could put this information. So instead of grants.gov, NIH Assist, and those things, we have Proposal Central. So both your letter of intent as well as the full application would be submitted on Proposal Central. And in the LOI instructions, it clearly lays out, what you need to do in order to begin creating a letter of intent. So the next question, we'll move over to the who. So once again, obviously you, and in terms of the phase 1 letter of intent phase, and the program officer, so myself, as well as our senior associate, Melanie Scott, who you saw on the website. So we're also here to answer any unique eligibility or other questions that you might have in terms of your background or the research you're proposing. Does it fit in line with the goals of the CASI program? Because for phase 1, you really are submitting the essay as well as the reference letter, that makes the reference letter quite important in terms of this is where they can be speaking to your achievements. They can mention some of your publications as well as talk about your scientific acumen, how you go about and approach scientific problems. So I would definitely speak with them and recommend, the types of things that they can include, because at this phase, you won't be submitting a biosketch or anything like that. So then for the full application phase, it's similar in terms of the program officer and associate being here to address questions. The mentor can provide the feedback, and then the reference letter that they submitted will be moved over and, still used for the full application phase. So it's the same one. And then here, your graduate advisor can also talk about your potential as a scientist during your graduate work, as well as what sorts of innovation you're bringing, for your research project for the CASI award. Any collaborators you have can also be there to demonstrate support for techniques and expertise. And then in terms of the institutional signing officials, so we don't have the same type of letter that you have to do for K99. It's really just a form where they just have to sign it, just so they know you're submitting, because, if you do receive the funds, the institution is who will be managing dispersing the funds to you. So now moving on to the how and the what, and I wanted to spend a bit of time in terms of thinking about how to structure a letter of intent, because I've been getting a lot of questions around this. There's no right or wrong answer, but these are the general characteristics of ones I've seen for individuals who have been successful in moving on to the next phase. And, in the first part, they really describe the key biological question that is remaining unanswered that they are seeking to address. And then in the middle part is where they provide additional background information and describe what needs to be accomplished to address that question. You can also put in your aims here and give some degree of detail about the experiments you plan to conduct in order to answer this question. And then in the last section, describing some of your future career goals in terms of, what your goal might be from a research standpoint when you become faculty, and emphasizing how your interdisciplinary training positions you to best address the research question you're proposing. And then also really emphasizing the overarching broad impact of the research that you're proposing. And I would say that's one of the key characteristics, excuse me, of the CASI awards. So in terms of structuring the specific aims, I think there are definitely a lot of similarities as we talked about for the K99, in terms of like the first one being your immediate postdoc training phase, the second one being your faculty phase and building the basis for R01 or other funding, and the third one talking about your longer term goals and synthesizing findings and demonstrating impact. One of the things I wanted to just point out, about CASI as it relates to K99, for K99, there's a lot of emphasis on, why you need that additional postdoc phase and what kinds of training you need. For CASI, there's not as much emphasis on why you would need additional training. It's more about the impact and what you're creating and, for the research project. And you don't have to have as much preliminary data as well. And we'll talk about that a bit in a second too. Some of the general tips, as I just mentioned, how innovative is the research being proposed? What's the appropriateness of the methods? What's the interdisciplinary nature of the proposed research? And is the candidate trained in physics, math, chemistry, or any of those areas we sort of talked about? And are they applying those types of approaches to address a biological question? So this, is also related to the next bullet, is what depth of training does the candidate have in a discipline other than biology? And how creative and original are the scientific approaches? And then, the last two things. So this next bullet is a new tool being developed for a specific purpose to solve a novel biological question. And I just mentioned this because oftentimes what we see with CASI is some really cool and creative engineering or engineered approaches and new things that are being created. And then the age-old question is, is it how excited are they, or is the review committee about this new tool versus is this new tool necessary, and are you talking about how you're going to use it to answer a novel biological question that really needs to be answered? And so if you are doing something where you're creating, this really cool thing, really articulating why we need it and why we needed to answer a certain biological question. And then the last bullet, I wanted to say, so for Burroughs Wellcome Fund, we really seek to fund high risk, high reward, high impact approaches. At the same time, you want to be wary of being too ambitious as to be unfeasible, but you don't necessarily have to have a lot of preliminary data for some of the CASI grants. I've looked back at some of the ones that have been successful, and it comes from people that have a successful past track record and then are, proposing to do something really interesting for the future. And there may be a bit of preliminary data, but it's not the extent that is needed or expected for some of the K99 awards. And the other thing I would say is that, as a private philanthropy, we really want to, provide funding for areas that are underserved. So if your application is something that should go to NIH for a K99 R00, then submit it there. And we don't want to fund things that should be K99. We want to fund things that maybe NIH would not fund, as an example. Or maybe there's, I guess I would just leave it at that, but just suffice to say that, we're really looking for things that have the potential for high impact and are willing to let individuals take risks. And I'll show you some of the feedback that some of the CASI awardees have actually said as it relates to that. And I think, all of this, when I mentioned some of those tips, those are also tied into how the applications are reviewed. So the criteria range from 1 outstanding all the way to 5 do not recommend. And we break it down by project plan, investigator, and impact on the CASI community. And all of these are described in the RFP. But looking at, what's the, how original and creative, is the research being proposed, and is it addressing a significant biological question? And then we're also funding the investigator. So it's a mix of, both the project plan as well as the investigator. So do they have the experience to move the project forward and a depth of training outside of biology and a potential for an independent research career? And I'm mentioning this because for the CASI program and these awards, you're not necessarily tied to the research. Like, let's say that you start doing it, and as you get the award and things don't go as expected, you are allowed to pivot into a new area. And then finally, the impact on the CASI community. So someone that cultivates collaborative and collegial relationships and brings an impactful, unique voice to the CASI and Burroughs Wellcome Fund community. So with that being said, I think the next thing I wanted to address is, or give you a sense of what the reviewers are thinking and how they are reviewing and what they have to say about both the letters of intent, the full application, as well as the interview. So looking here, this is for the phase 1 letters of intent. So these are all paraphrased, anonymized comments. And this is for green are ones that advance to the next stage. Red were no-goes that did not advance. So this is just to give you a sense of what reviewers are thinking. So in one case, they commented about how success would be remarkable. Their past track record in training is excellent, and the work is very innovative. Another comment about a separate award or separate application mentioned how this is really at the interface because of their analytical chemistry and their computational background. And they had some additional comments about what the project was focused on. In another case, mentioning how it really is interface work, solving a very important problem with cutting edge methods, and the candidate was very high quality. So the ones that were no-go, in terms of the letter of intent phase, one of the commonalities that I found when I, looked through this was the word vague, or the idea that the letter of intent was vague. So you can see, in this first case over here, the reviewers thought it was actually a very well-written introduction and all of that, but the overall essay was exceptionally vague in terms of what they were actually going to do on an experimental level. And this middle one, they mentioned the goal was very compelling, but once again, there's little information about what experiments would be done. And also in this case, they said the reference letter didn't provide much information about the candidate. And that's why I wanted to emphasize how important it is for the reference letter to include, additional information. And this last one here, there was another comment about how important the research seemed, but the proposal was extremely vague and claimed to solve everything about this particular area with both computation and artificial intelligence. So, with that being said, another thing I wanted to point out as it relates to the letters of intent is that, on one end, you've got things that are too vague, but then on the other end, so I talked to some of our review committee, and they said, if there's so much scientific jargon there that a non-specialist audience can't understand it, it was also difficult for them to effectively review it. So, you've got both ends of this, too vague as well as using too much scientific jargon. So what you really want to do is to try to find that balance in the middle where you're giving enough detail for them to understand what you're doing, but you're not couching it in so much scientific jargon that, if this is not their field, they're not going to understand what all of the acronyms and other things are that you're putting in there. So now moving away from the letter of intent, and we're going to move to looking at comments on the full application and comparing full applications that were high ranked along with those that were ranked lower. So in this case, they mentioned the candidate was great. The approach was interesting. They thought the ideas were creative and had a potential for broad impact. In this middle case, they mentioned the candidate was excellent. Their proposal to test this certain thing and separate them from these other areas was interesting. At the same time, the reviewer did have some questions with an aspect of their research, but they still found the work exciting overall. And then this final example, the reviewer pointed out both the physics and the other background of the candidate, really a nod to their interdisciplinary training. They thought the candidate or the application was strong and could really have a sizable impact on the field. At the same time, they still expressed some concerns that possibly the candidate hadn't fully thought through how this approach was going to be used in this certain situation. Ones that were lower ranked, so just to give you a sense of those. So what you see on the left, in this case, the reviewer thought the proposal was only addressing something incrementally. So although, it was exciting, it could help in this particular area, they thought it was too specific and likely not the best fit for the award. This one in the middle, the candidate was strong, great letters of recommendation. They think the area is important, but they didn't feel that new ground was being broken relative to what was already being done in the field. And this last one here, the reviewer thought the candidate was very good, had a strong physics background, but they had concerns about their experimental approach and thought that the way they were setting up their modeling approach may not be informative because of the manner in which they were setting it up. And then finally, I'll show you some of the comments that our reviewers had from the interview phase. So these are ones that were actually funded. So you can see, here they talk about how it's a risky approach. They actually weren't convinced that it was going to work, but after going through the interview process, they really did a great job of answering questions, ones that were related to the reviewers' doubts. They thought it was high risk and something other funders would not necessarily fund. So that kind of alludes back to what I mentioned earlier is in terms of, what we're looking to fund at Burroughs Wellcome. In the middle one, it's a perfect example of someone working at the interface. If the approach works, it will have lots of applications and be very impactful. And then the final example, they mentioned, that something is really high risk and high reward based on how they answered the questions. They felt they were very well aware of what's happening, had thought through and anticipated problems and how to solve them, and thought they were also very strong in outreach and leadership. For ones that were not funded, I think really the key aspect of this is that some of their answers were vague and they didn't do as good of a job of answering the questions. In this case, they mentioned it didn't seem like it was clear to the reviewers what direction the research was going and how different other approaches could be connected in. In the middle one, you see in this example, they thought they were hedging on answering questions and were trying to also force the connection to one of the fields of interest called out on the RFP that wasn't necessarily there, and it wasn't clear why we should expect progress now as opposed to 20 years ago. And then the final one, they thought they did a fairly good job of answering questions, and they were also concerned that the particular thing they were studying may not be biologically relevant. So, I just wanted to give you a sense of getting into the minds of the reviewers, and what they're thinking, as we go through each stage of the CASI process. And then finally, ending on the what, which is kind of highlighting some of the similarities and differences between the K99 and the CASI award. And some of these I've pointed out before in terms of eligibility. It's 4 years for K99, 5 years for CASI. Resubmissions, it's 1 for K99, unlimited for CASI. International fellows are eligible to apply. Indirect costs are covered here. We do not cover them with CASI. I didn't really speak a whole lot about flexibility other than to mention when I did mention how you could pivot your project if you need to, but just wanted to mention, with funding from a nonprofit organization, there is a whole lot of flexibility that comes with the funding, and it can vary, whenever we're talking about government funding. Summary statement. So you do receive that with the K99. Unfortunately, you don't receive that for CASI, but one of the things that I implemented this year was to meet with all of the individuals who interviewed, but did not receive the award in order to give them feedback for the future. And then in terms of the phases, there's one here. There's 2 written phases plus a 3rd interview phase for CASI. And then, for reviewers, I mentioned how they are known for CASI. They are mostly ad hoc for the K99 R00. And then in terms of funding amount, that's going to vary. So you want to look at the IC guidelines for the K99, and then, the funding amount for CASI now this year is $560,000. And, before I end, I wanted to at least show you a few things that our CASI awardees have to say and touch on some of the things that we have been doing to support CASI awardees. In this particular case, an awardee mentions how using the CASI award to fund was really helpful for funding risky projects for which they didn't have preliminary data. And you see that same trend come through, and this other comment which said that CASI allowed their lab to take bigger risks earlier in their career, which was very critical to initiating their career at a stage when they didn't have preliminary data. And they mentioned how important the CASI network is. What we do for CASI awardees, we combine and analyze all of the both salary data as well as lab startup data, and give individuals an idea of what to expect if they're going to a biology versus an engineering versus a physics department. I guess a caveat of this is looking backwards 10 years, so you would expect the more recent data to be higher. But on average, it has been about 136,000 over the past 10 years. And then in terms of startups, we also broke it down by department, and the average has been about 1.3 million. But we've been working with people to assist them in the negotiation process and to make sure that lots of things are addressed, as well as teaching load and this type of thing. And I'm also going to be starting up a webinar series aiding our CASI grantees. And so with all of that said, I just wanted to provide some final thoughts and, remind you not to neglect your own self-care through this process. I know that applying for a grant definitely can take a bit of time and mental energy. And just mentioning the power of yet. And I think this is, when I alluded earlier to those individuals who applied actually several times and didn't get the actual grant itself, I think that they must have had a mindset of, they haven't gotten it now, or they just haven't gotten it yet. And they wound up going on to successful academic careers and getting funding, and then even becoming tenured investigators in their career. So, I guess thinking if this is really the path that you want to take, keeping that in mind, and also acknowledging some of the research out there indicating that you don't absolutely have to have the funding, and how going through this process will help you when it comes to applying for those faculty positions. And finally, just wanted to say good luck to all of you out there, as you're writing your application, whether it's for a K99, a CASI, or some other application. And then I really wanted to acknowledge individuals that have helped me, especially Bill Schrader, who, a lot of this was based on knowledge that essentially I learned from him about how to oversee the K99 R00 program. Kelly Rose, who was a former program officer at Burroughs Wellcome Fund, running the CASI program before me, and Melanie Scott, who is our senior program associate here, and Daniel Baroff, who was also assisting her and has now been promoted and is working with some other programs. And then our president and CEO at Burroughs Wellcome, Lou Muglia. And this is our building. We're in Research Triangle Park, and I will leave it here if there's any more questions about the CASI program.
Thank you, Tammy. And yes, there are some questions. Echo what you said, that every faculty panel we've had, they have said that no, funding is not a requirement to get a tenure track job. So that's very true. So our questions from Catherine: can you submit the same project to K99 and CASI at the same time?
You can, but you can't hold the same grant. So we have had people that have gotten, we actually had someone that got a K99 and the CASI and had to make a decision which one they wanted. So yes, you can.
Thank you. And does CASI require green card or citizenship? I think we know the answer to this is no, it does not. Correct?
Does not, no.
For the first author publication requirement, if putting down our graduate research publication, does it have to be related to the postdoc/faculty research proposal?
No.
How important?
Especially, I was going to say, especially if you're training in physics or something, and you want to move into biological questions, then you would expect in some cases it may be quite unrelated.
Got it. How important is it to have publication and track record with the mentors for the CASI award? If my research proposal for the training phase is more related to a neighboring lab or PI than my current postdoc lab, where I don't have any publication record yet, how will the reviewers view it? Or should I have my current mentor and the other PI as co-mentors for this research proposal?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe they should follow up with me one-on-one to have a broader discussion about that at the individual level. And I'd be willing to, actually, Molly, I don't know if you saw my email that went out the other day with my Calendly, where I had offered some, I'll send you a link. I have a link set up right now for people to set up a brief appointment with me to talk one-on-one, and I'll send you that after this. And you can share with those who might want to meet with me for more individual questions.
Great, thank you. So follow up on the first question: if the K99 and CASI proposals are on different topics, can we get both awards?
No. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you do that, well, I mean, then you prevent others from receiving a grant as well. So yeah, unfortunately, no.
Yeah. No, you don't have to apologize. You're giving us money. That's good. Is it generally possible for someone to submit 2 different proposals to different institutions at the same time for K99 R00?
So, oh, they're talking about like 2 ICs.
I think so.
Yeah, no, so what happens is you submit a single application, but you get to indicate which institute you want it to go to, and you can rank them 1, 2, and 3. So you can't submit like 1 to one institution, 1 to another. It's going to be forced to be one or the other. And that's where I think the question came earlier, you know, how do you work that out if it's relevant to both? And I would say having the conversation and even bringing both program officers in together, because sometimes even once things are submitted, they will talk to each other. If let's say they've got an application that actually maybe someone submitted it to their institute, but they know it's more applicable to another one, they will, you know, contact them and possibly have it rerouted there. So I think having that conversation with the program officers.
Right. All right, that's the end of the questions in the chat. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to put in the chat? Or unmute themselves and ask Tammy directly? Meanwhile, I'm going to look for that bit.ly link for your meetings, Tammy.
Yeah, and actually I might be able to drop it in the chat now if I can restart or get my Outlook to open back up again. Let me see. Yes, I can drop it in now. I found the link. So yeah. Put it in the chat. Okay, now. Okay, there you go.
There it is. Perfect. All right, we'll give everybody a chance to copy that. And if there are no other questions, we will let Tammy go rest her voice after giving her a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Tammy. That was amazing. What
Thanks
a great overview.
It's good to see everybody. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome back to Duke. Everybody, Tammy got her PhD at Duke, just in case you didn't know. So thank you, Tammy.
All right.
See everybody later. Bye-bye.
Bye.